If you knew Tyshawn Sorey as a jazz drummer, now you know he's so much more than that. Proof once again of the absolute inadequacy of genre labels, boundaries, and whatnot. Welcome back to the Ojai Festival live stream. I'm Steve Smith, Director of Publications for National Sawdust, and we are going to be continuing throughout the day and throughout the night with magnificent music like that. We're also going to be talking with the participants in this year's festival, and it is my very, very great privilege and pleasure now to get to speak with someone who's not just been an artist who I admire and follow, but someone who's been a friendly acquaintance now for many years, and we've done a number of things together, and it's just a tremendous opportunity to talk to Jennifer Coe, who was featured prominently in yesterday's concert and will also be performing again in tonight's late night concert at 10:30 p.m. So thank you for being here and talking
Steve.
with me.
Thank you for talking with me.
Oh, it is always, always a pleasure. Now, Jennifer's program tonight is from her Bach and Beyond series, in which she has arranged for the sonatas and partitas, the unaccompanied great works of Johann Sebastian Bach, to be involved with and contemporary works, modern works, some of which she has commissioned, some of which are standard pieces of the repertory already. And so I just wanted to start by talking about what it was that inspired you to take on this project or conceive this project in the first place?
Oh, in the first place?
In the first place.
Well, it was a couple things. First of all, it's so normal to have piano recitals that are just piano. And I wanted to show that violin, if you program in a really good way or in a strong way, can carry an entire program and has the range and color and expressive capability. I think I also wanted to kind of explore the influence of Bach on generations of composers. Mm-hmm. I think there was something very moving to me about Bach having not been commissioned to write these pieces. He just felt this creative need
right.
and to write these works over the course of 17 years of his life. And it's almost like a personal musical journal of his artistic development, and you can see how much he evolves. I think particularly he starts breaking the models in the second sonata, and then quite significantly breaks the model and the form in the second partita, which I'll play tonight.
All right. And of the pieces that you're performing tonight, you've got one by Missy Mazzoli, one by Esa-Pekka Salonen, and then something that could be considered a contemporary staple by Luciano Berio. And I wonder, are there specific ways in which you feel or even hear these particular pieces interfacing and interacting with Bach's language?
Yes. I mean, ideally for Bach and Beyond, I like to bookend the programs, because
right.
I think how we hear then Bach after we've heard contemporary works shifts a great deal. Mm-hmm. But the late night program is only 1 hour.
Only 1 hour, right.
So I decided to build it all around the chaconne. So Missy Mazzoli's piece, she wrote this piece for me, is based on that D minor chord, and then kind of goes in a totally different direction, and kind of ends on this very high pitch of B, natural. And then I dive in, because I also love thinking about how you shift people's pitch worlds. So then we move into the Berio, which is A, but it's this kind of struggle around the note of A throughout. And so we hit B flat, we hit quite a bit, we hit B natural. So we're kind of within that kind of circle. And then with Esa-Pekka's piece, we return to D. And I think what's quite beautiful as well is that, it's this play in the chaconne between minor and major. That's the last movement of the D minor partita. And he really leaves it open-ended, because you don't have a chord that determines where we are going. And so it's really up to the listener to decide, are we transforming back to major? Do we return to lightness? Or are we remaining in this kind of dark? And so I think Missy's piece kind of does that harmonically. Mm-hmm. So I was also thinking a lot about kind of pitch worlds, and then in terms of range on the violin. So I don't know. I think about a lot of things when I program.
Right. That's a very multi-dimensional approach to assembling what could be a tossed off 1 hour late night, bring them down gently gig. It sounds like we've got the sort of rigor and integrity that we've come to expect from your work. And this is not the only project of yours in which you have put together an engagement between past music, present music, contemporary music, and music that has not even been conceived yet. There's also your Bridge to Beethoven project, which is, among other things, where you interacted fruitfully with Vijay Iyer, the music director of this year's Ojai Festival, who wrote a piece that was in response or in dialogue with the Kreutzer Sonata. So, well, first off, tell me, was that your first creative interaction with Vijay?
Well, I was actually on this panel for this award, and I didn't know Vijay at all. And I heard his piece, Mozart Effects, and I just thought it was extraordinary. And so actually on the application, they had contact information on it. And I was like, I'm just going to keep that in my phone. And then I decided to wait a year and one day before I contacted him because I thought that was, I don't know, the proper thing to do, I guess.
Okay.
And then I asked him to write for Bridge to Beethoven. I kind of knew, I think, already. I don't know if I spoke to him that early on about doing a concerto, but I already had the idea in my mind. And as the working relationship progressed, I think, with the Bridge Tower Fantasy, it just felt very natural to progress. And for me, artistic relationships are very long and fruitful and kind of lifelong, whether they're between performers or between composers and musicians. But I think ultimately what it's about is, there are so many things that are happening in the world right now, so many things that are happening in this country, and it's really about building a world that you imagine that you want. And if you can build that as an artist, and it might not be for even our lifetime, but even for the next generation, I feel like that's a goal, an artistic goal in my life. Which is why it's so important to me to work with composers. Because not only do we kind of, Vijay's piece is part of this larger project I'm doing called Mixtape, where I'm asking all of these composers to engage with contemporary topics. And so let's hope that all of these things don't exist in 400 years. I really hope that that's true. But you want to hold that emotional content, right? Because there's something so human about that sense of that kind of human experience that we all go through, which I think is encapsulated beautifully in Trouble.
Well, and I think that you made a very important point, because a lot of times I think we can kind of look at classical music as this sort of abstract thing that stands sort of apart from or above the mean and measure of contemporary life, and it's not part of our world. It's not part of our milieu. For some people, it's relaxation. For some people, it's escape, etc., etc. And one of the things that I think was really important about Trouble last night, and this is the violin concerto of which we heard the world premiere with Jennifer and the International Contemporary Ensemble and the Oberlin Contemporary Music Ensemble, exactly, and the great Stephen Schick on the podium. I think that's everybody, right? It was just so impressive to know that the concerto was not only affected by contemporary life, but it was absolutely, in some ways, a response to the way that we are feeling as human beings, confronted with the divisiveness that's out there, the seeming, dysfunction that's out there. And so I kind of wondered about that. How did the piece come to be originally?
I mean, initially we had just kind of, one of the things I wanted to explore was to play around with the idea and the form of concerto, and because it's a very old form, so kind of redefining what that genre is, and the role of violin doesn't necessarily have to be in that romantic Bildungsroman kind of heroic place. But I think with so many of the things that have been happening, it really makes you reflect upon, where does classical music also fit in the world? How do we serve our communities? Do we reflect our communities? Do we reflect the diversity in our communities? Do we reflect the fact that females are 50% of the population? Reflect the action that's happened in the last 50 years?
Right.
My mom came to this country. She was a refugee in the Korean War, and she came to this country only because in 1965, which is only like 50 years ago,
Right.
they started allowing people of color to naturalize and become citizens in the United States. So I think my generation is the first generation to actually be American, I guess, and born in this country, but from a different background, I guess, or from a different place. So, but that's only grown, right? And are we as an artistic field truly serving our community if we are not telling those stories, if we're not making room, if we are not modeling, if we don't give space to these voices with different experiences? I remember as a student, I studied with Felix Galimir, and he was an important mentor to me. And a huge part of what he taught me was the incredibly difficult experience of being in the Vienna Philharmonic before World War II, and how Bronislaw Huberman essentially saved his life. How his colleagues, because they were just giving in lists of all of the Jewish musicians. So this is also a tradition that has been passed down in classical music in a way. And my dearest teacher, Jamie Loredo, came from Bolivia. And just the amount of, I think, personal struggle and familial history that comes. These are voices and musical voices and artistic voices and creative voices that need to be heard.
Right.
And I feel that this festival is really wonderful. It's been wonderful to be a part of it because it feels very inclusionary.
Right, and this one in particular, where the festival just cuts across so many. I keep turning to the word genre because it's almost like a twitchy music critic reflex. That's just how we're wired. But I think Vijay has been very eloquent in trying to reframe that discussion so that it's not about genre, it's not about this is classical and this is jazz and here's South Indian Carnatic music, but it's about communities, and here, in a sense, a very real sense, it's about the intersection of those communities. And I actually find your working relationship with Vijay to be emblematic of that same impulse, because it would have been just so easy to say, well, Vijay is a jazz pianist and so I don't commission him to write a concerto, but yet he is not. You saw past that kind of definition. We have this concerto now, and I want to speak now because we've talked about the sort of social and cultural aspects. I want to talk about the fact that it's also just a challenging but ravishingly beautiful piece of music. What were the actual technical aspects of working on this, and what did you find especially satisfying as a performer?
Well, I just want to address that I think in general, great artists are great artists, right? And then there's just a kinship and a love that happens between those artists. And it doesn't matter if they are a stage director like Robert Wilson, or if they're a composer, or if they're female, or if they're of color, or if they're not. It's just great artists are great artists. And there's a kinship because there's great care and great dedication that goes into making that art. And there's a vision that people will not stop working until they reach that vision. And I think, so in that sense, I don't believe in genres. I just believe in good or bad.
Right, sure.
So that's, but you asked another question. I'm sorry.
Well, just in terms of, we've talked about the sort of political and cultural ramifications of Vijay's piece, but we haven't actually addressed the aesthetic experience of it and what it was like for you as a performer, what its challenges were, and what satisfied you especially about doing it. So
I think, well, the thing I love doing is, a lot of the composers I work with, it's their first violin concerto. And I feel like it's not about me. It's really about giving them the space to experiment and really write the piece that they, never even imagined that they would write, and to give them that space, and then myself that dedication. So it's actually like kind of an intense process to birth it. because there is a lot of back and forth, and there is a lot of collaboration in that sense. But in terms of, I mean, his vision was very clear. What shape and form, when he had written the previous Bridge Tower Fantasy, the second movement is completely improvised, and there were just words.
Right.
And so I was more familiar with that. So the first movement and then the interlude, which is the fifth movement, is kind of completely improvised and free, my part. And then there's just a rhythmic drive. I had asked him to name a movement after Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American who was beaten to death by fellow auto workers in Detroit the night before he was to be married, because they thought he was Japanese, mostly because that was a moment in my life, it happened in the 80s, where I remembered how terrified my parents were and how terrified I was, because it was the first realization, I think, for them, because for first-generation immigrants, they were the majority in their country.
Right.
And I think it was this wake-up call that you can just be killed, not based on who you are, but just on the color of your skin. So that movement, I feel like, for me, is the heartbeat of it's really the heart of the entire work. And then the drive that happens after that. It's almost like this. I mean, even the very opening prelude and then the interlude almost feels like a birth and then a rebirth. Mm-hmm. And the Chin is kind of the heart of the work. And it's kind of finding one's steps and one's place in the world. So it feels very much like a journey to me.
Now, I want to talk just a little bit to the extent that you're aware at this stage of where the concerto goes next. I know it's coming to Tanglewood, but could you tell people when they're going to have more opportunities to hear this work performed if they didn't happen to be here for the Glorious Birth last night?
Well, we're performing it at Berkeley next week, and Tanglewood, I think, on July 13, and then hopefully many other places.
Okay, so that's what you know right now.
That's what I know right now.
Now
we can all make petitions.
right now. Well, I mean, obviously, since we're sitting here talking and having this conversation, I have to ask you about your new podcast and what it's meant to do. What are you addressing with this new podcast that you're launching? Well,
it's interesting you talk about genre, right? So, so everybody sees jazz as like improvised, mm-hmm. right? And then classical is totally written. Mm-hmm. But it didn't used to be like that in classical. And so I wanted to kind of try to obliterate that separation between performer and composer.
Well done.
And so the podcast Shared Madness is really about that process of birthing a piece, essentially. That's solo violin, so it's a lot simpler, mm-hmm. which is me, so it's like simpler than writing a concerto in mm-hmm. a lot of ways. But I think it's actually quite difficult because a lot more things are much more exposed. Material has to be super distilled. Compositional material has to be really distilled. But most of all, I think... these were a community of composers that I went to pay off a loan for my violin, and the donor generously agreed to do it in exchange for commissions. And so I started every conversation with, please feel free to say no, to my kind of community of composers, and I was so moved because almost everyone said yes. Yeah, but after it was like a lot of pieces came in like 24 hours before. So right. It was like, I think the next project should be called like Calm because it was like, and the entire process was a little bit like that going into the world premieres. But
Marvelous. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and out of this beautiful day to come over and talk about what's going on.